Today we're going to start our next major topic, which is trigonometry and SOHCAHTOA. So let's start off with the word trigonometry. Trigonometry means the study of triangles. Now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on right triangles, which of course means any triangle that has a right angle in it. Now here's some vocab that you guys know, but I want to refresh with you before we move on. Every right triangle has what's called a hypotenuse, and that's the side that's directly opposite from the right angle. Now the other two sides of the triangle, the two that are not the hypotenuse, we call the legs. So every triangle has one hypotenuse and two legs. Now, when we start doing a trigonometry problem, and from now on for the notes, I'm just going to say trig for short. So we say trig for trigonometry. So in a trig problem, we need to know which angle we're talking about. So every triangle has three sides and three angles. Now in a right triangle, one of them is the right angle. We're going to be talking about one of the other two angles. We call them acute angles because they're both less than 90. And from that angle, we're going to use it to label the sides. So number one, we label the hypotenuse. You'll see in a minute that's going to end up being the easy one because that's just the one opposite the right angle. It never changes. Now the other ones, you don't want to just call them leg and leg because we want to be able to differentiate between the two. So we're going to call them opposite, and from that we mean opposite from the angle that we're talking about in the problem. Remember, we have to pick one angle we're talking about, and one of the legs is opposite from it, and one of them is adjacent to that angle, and adjacent means next to or connected to. So let's look at a couple examples of that here. So let's say I give you this triangle right here, triangle ABC, and you can see I already labeled the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is very easy because it never changes. I can see that little box, that little square on the angle B, which means that's the right angle. So if I go from that box up to the opposite side of the triangle, that's going to be the hypotenuse. Now the other two angles are A and C. So we have to decide which one we're using in this question. So for this question, I said, let's say we're talking about angle A. I'm going to talk about this angle right here. Now what that means is when I go to label opposite and adjacent, it would look like this. Because opposite means opposite from that angle. So once I decided I was talking about angle A, right there, that's the opposite. Opposite means across the triangle from that angle. And adjacent means next to that angle, connected to that angle. So that's how you figure out what opposite and adjacent are. Now if we look at the exact same triangle, but let's say this time I'm talking about angle C. So this time I'm talking about this angle here. What it actually does is it flips opposite and adjacent. Because now when I'm talking about opposite, I mean opposite from angle C, and it's actually down here. And adjacent means next to angle C, so it ends up being the one on the right side there. So the key point you want to take from this, the hypotenuse never changes. It doesn't matter if I'm talking about angle A or angle C, the hypotenuse stays right where it is. But opposite and adjacent do, so be careful on that. You got to know which angle you're talking about in the question and use that to determine which of the legs is opposite and which is adjacent. Okay, so that leads into our main thing for today. You have to have that picture down. You have to know what we mean when we're talking about opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse before we can learn this next step. So what we're going to do, we're going to learn what are called the trig ratios. And a ratio is a fraction, and we're going to make fractions from those side lengths. So first of all, these are the names of our three trig functions, our three main trig functions. They might look familiar to you guys because they have buttons on the calculator. So the first one is called sine, and the word is spelled S-I-N-E, but you're going to think of it as S-I-N. That's how we abbreviate in problems, and that's the button on the calculator. The second one is called cosine, and we're going to abbreviate that C-O-S. And the third one is called tangent, and we're going to abbreviate that T-A-N. So if you have a scientific calculator in front of you right now, take a look at it because you'll see those three buttons. You'll see one that says SIN for sine, and COS for cosine, and TAN for tangent. Now, the second part of the title of this section was SOHCAHTOA. Now, SOHCAHTOA isn't a word. It's 3 sets of 3 letters, and what it really is a memory trick. Each letter stands for something. So we use that, I'll call it a word, even though it's not really a word. We use the word SOHCAHTOA as a memory trick to remember how to make the trig ratios. So the first letter of each one, the S, the C, and the T, those are our 3 trig functions. S means sine, C means cosine, and T means tangent. Now the other letters are all some combination of O's and H's and A's. That comes from the triangle we just talked about. So over here, OH, AH, OA. Those letters stand for opposite, hypotenuse, or adjacent. Each 3 letters give you a ratio. And remember, a ratio is a fraction. So what we're kind of doing here is we're making a fraction out of the 2 letters. So what you have here, like for example, if you look at the first one, the S stands for sine, and the next 2 letters are a fraction, something over something. So that would be opposite over hypotenuse. That's what the O and the H mean. And then you look at the middle group. The C stands for cosine. Well, that would be adjacent over hypotenuse. That's A and H. And then the last one, T, stands for tangent. So tangent would end up equaling opposite over adjacent. And let's go ahead and just put that into the notes here. So the first one, from SOH, S sine equals O opposite over H hypotenuse. The middle one, C cosine equals A adjacent over H hypotenuse. The third one, T tangent equals O opposite over A adjacent. So each 3 letters gives you first the name of the trig function, sine, cosine, or tangent, and then what that fraction is equal to. You'll be equals, and then the next 2 letters tell you something over something. So let's finish up our notes today by taking this triangle here, and let's evaluate sine, cosine, and tangent for angle B below. Now, in order to do this problem, the first thing you do is you label. Label opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So when I'm doing that, I always do hypotenuse first. So right down here in the bottom right corner, I see this little right triangle symbol. That means if I go across the triangle opposite from that one, that's going to be the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always opposite from the right angle. So the 5 is the hypotenuse in this one. Now for the opposite and adjacent, you have to be careful. So you have to look back at the question and say, this time I'm talking about angle B. And angle B is this one up here on the top. That means the 4 is the opposite, because it's opposite from the B. And the 3 is adjacent, because it's adjacent or next to angle B. So that's what you do first for all of these questions. Whenever you're doing a trig problem, you always look at your triangle and you label opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse first. Now for the rest of the question, I'm going to use SOHCAHTOA. So let me just write this down here at the bottom. SOHCAHTOA, SOHCAHTOA. Now let's use each one. So let's start with the S. S stands for sine. Oh, and one thing, every time you write sine, cosine, or tangent, remember how in the notes it said sine of x and cosine of x and tangent of x? It's actually whatever the angle is. So once you decide you're talking about angle B, that's what goes after the word sine. So we're talking about the sine of angle B here. Now it's going to equal a fraction, and it's going to be O opposite. So I look over here at the bottom of the triangle, the opposite is 4, so I'm going to put a 4 there. And it's going to be over H, hypotenuse. And I look at the picture, the H is 5, hypotenuse is 5. And that's the answer. The answer is 4/5, or you can grab a calculator and divide it if you want. Instead of leaving as a fraction, it would be 0.8. Now let's do the same thing for cosine and tangent. So cosine of B, now I look for the C. It's going to equal a fraction again. This time it's adjacent A, which is 3 in my picture, over hypotenuse H, which is 5. And again, you can leave it or you can divide it on a calculator. It would be 0.6. And then the last one would be tangent of B. Remember, these are all for B. So again, once I tell you what angle we're talking about, that's the letter that comes after sine, cosine, and tangent. And I look down at SOHCAHTOA. It's going to be a fraction again. On top is opposite, which would be 4, over adjacent, which is 3. And you can leave it as 4 over 3, or you can divide it. It would be about 1.33. It would be repeating, but you can round. And all of those things together are your answers, because I asked you to do all 3. But that's how SOHCAHTOA works. It's 2 steps. Step 1, you have to label the sides opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse correctly. You have to do that right. Then, from SOHCAHTOA, you have to answer whatever the question is. I might ask you what is sine of this angle or tangent of this angle, or I might ask you all 3 like I did here. But once you have the picture set up right, it's real easy to do that.